Okay, why don't we go ahead and jump in? My name is Brian Orender. I'm president of Charitable Advisors and publisher of the Not-for-Profit News in Indianapolis. And I'm going to be, I think, kind of emceeing, hosting today. Have really enjoyed getting to know the Luna team over the last few months and partnering with them. And they've given me this opportunity to showcase them. So think of me as the picture frame, and they're the picture today. In bringing some exciting information to you. This has been really, it's been interesting for me kind of learning more about translation services and what a big difference and how accessible they are in term to nonprofits. So got just kind of a few introductions here on your screen. You see Una Hartzell and Tiffany Hansen, who'll be presenters today. And then was it Magnificent Rebecca Bahan? No, that's not exactly. It was a really amazing, but Rebecca's our interpreter today. So you'll see her in the box. So Luna Language Services provides translation. You know, I'm gonna get my notes here. So I've got everything right here. Provides translation and interpretation services to organizations throughout the state of Indiana and across the country. So I know on today's webinar, we have people from all across. It's not just central Indiana. They work with a lot of local nonprofit organizations here in Indiana and have some insights to share to help nonprofits plan for language support resources. Tiffany gave me a couple statistics that I thought were interesting. She said that more than 67 million people in the United States speak a foreign language at home, that's a much bigger number than I would have estimated. And here in Indianapolis, at least 13% use a language other than English at home. And one of the kind of quick gut checks that they've shared with me that I've been sharing with clients for the last month is kind of looking at the demographics of the clients that you serve and comparing that demographic to kind of the immediate community. That there was one organization that I was working with during our or in the time frame of our session last month, that they were looking at kind of the demographics of the Castleton area. That's the northeast side of Indianapolis, which is pretty diverse now. It's changed a lot over the last 10 or 20 years, and yet they were realizing that everybody they were serving were pretty much coming from Fishers and Carmel, and that they really weren't serving the immediate community that they were in. So I think this is interesting for a lot of organizations that may not even be aware of what the potential is. So as we go through this, our speakers are anxious to respond to your questions. If you have questions, please use the chat, and I will try to keep an eye on that, and we'll pose those questions to our speakers as we move through. So first, I want to introduce Tiffany Hansen. She is the Outreach and Engagement Manager with Luna, and she'll be starting the discussion today with an overview of how language services are priced. She'll also walk you through an example of how our organization might budget for a few different projects during the year. I think this is just particularly important because I think those of us that aren't familiar with this can just kind of automatically assume that these services would be beyond our budget. So she's going to help teach us how this can be worked into grant proposals, how it can be budgeted, and how it should be affordable for just about any organization if you take a planned approach to it. So Tiffany, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Hold on just a minute. Sorry about that.
It's okay. All the chat questions are going to be, is that Tiffany's cat or what happened?
So my name is Tiffany Hansen. As Brian mentioned, I'm the Outreach and Engagement Manager with Luna Language Services. I do a lot of work to teach our clients and members of the community exactly what we're talking about today. How can you make your programs, services, and career opportunities more accessible to our community members who speak languages in addition to English? So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oops, there we go. All right.
There
So
we go.
for those of you who are not familiar with Luna Language Services, as Brian mentioned, we are a language services provider, and we do provide interpretation services in addition to translation services. We categorize anything that is written as translation. That could include written documents, that could be captions on videos, that could also be work like voiceovers on videos. We view anything that is a live translation as interpretation services. So that includes our event interpreter today, Rebecca. That could also be someone coming to your office and helping you to essentially translate or interpret a conversation with one of your consumers. So just to get some basic terminology there up front. We do a lot of work in language access planning, and we recently hosted a language access planning workshop, which we do have recorded. And what I'll do is I will, for those of you who registered for this event, I'll send you a link to that recording. And then for those of you who are viewing with us on YouTube, I'll put a link to that recording in the description. But essentially, what I wanted to do today was take the basic components of language access planning and think about those as we think about budgeting for what these services might look like for your organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about language demographics. We'll talk a little bit about some specific examples or opportunities where language barriers might occur. And then we'll really dive into understanding resources that you may have available and thinking about putting those resources in place, what that cost looks like. Maybe my next slide will come up. Oh,
There you go.
all right. So the first thing we're going to think about is outlining specific goals to your organization as they relate to communicating with LEP. That's a common term in our industry. It means limited English proficient. So communicating with LEP community members. So what I want to do is I want to encourage you to utilize real data. And this is kind of something Brian mentioned in his intro, utilizing real data to start thinking about what does my service area actually look like from a language demographic standpoint. Language is not a cultural characteristic that we can see unless you see someone speaking another language or signing. So there are resources out there that will help you to understand what your community looks like from that perspective. The most common one that we see utilized is a website called lep.gov. This takes data from census information as well as other reliable data sources. And one of the tools that they have that's really helpful is this map that is, it's a national map. Here I've just blown up what Indiana looks like since that's where Luna is located. But you can break down even each of these counties and you can see what percentage of different languages are spoken. Here they have it in a pie chart, but you can click on it and it'll give you, you know, a list of what those languages and percentages are as well. They also have other links on that website that can help you to find more specific data that you may be looking for. So it's a really good kind of centralized location to find out what those data demographics are. You can also reach out to language service providers like Luna. Because it's federally mandated for organizations that are providing public service. It's federally mandated for them to provide language access. A lot of those organizations are the organizations that Luna works with. So we work with the school systems, the hospital systems, the court systems. So our organization can also have a really big database of what languages may be represented in your community based upon the languages that we service in those areas. So we can also be a really good resource for you. I don't know why my slides aren't advancing very well. There we go. So we're going to kind of put together some data demographics for Marion County, which is the Indianapolis area. So what I've done is from the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey, I have found some information that shows the population and poverty by language and age. Now this is 2006 to 2010. We're still waiting for recent census data to be updated. So this data is a little bit outdated, but it can give you a good starting point. And so here I pulled some data about the population and poverty that speaks Spanish. So we're going to utilize that for our example today. So if I know the population and poverty that speaks Spanish, then if my organization is an organization that serves impoverished communities, then that can be a really good opportunity for me to target the Spanish speaking population and take them into consideration as a first language group. So the example that I'm going to kind of walk you through today is going to be based upon like what maybe a food pantry might take into consideration. So here, if we're just looking at the data, what I did was I used the same date range and took the total population in Marion County, and then the percentage of the population that lives in poverty in Marion County. So that was 17.2%. And then I took that same number of the Spanish speaking residents that are living in poverty in that same year, 2010. And we got a percentage of residents living in poverty who are Spanish speaking. So we'll be using this number moving forward through this example. The second part of thinking about budgeting for language access was identifying communication pathways where language barriers may occur. I like to think about this in kind of buckets of communication. So the first is going to be outreach, where you're trying to get consumers to come to your organization and build awareness. Some of those communication tools may be printed marketing assets, social media posts, community event discussions. So just thinking about any time when you're communicating with the public or with your consumers, what are the tools or the pathways that you use, right? So these could all be places where you may have a language barrier. I think about the second bucket as engagement. So first you have outreach, then you have when you actually connect with the consumer. So that could look like a customer service or a helpline, consumer assessments. I know a lot of folks do those on the front end, program applications, et cetera, et cetera. Then when we have the consumer and they're ready to engage in our programs, I think about, how we onboard that consumer into the organization and the programming. So that could look like actual program materials or even just materials that are explaining the benefits of the program. And then just ongoing communications. How are you delivering service and programming to those LEP consumers? What does your customer service look like with those consumers? And how is your communication being handled? So this is where we start to get into pricing. So this pricing is all specific to Luna, but I will say that it's pricing that we see a lot of other agencies our size utilizing. So this may be like a good baseline for you to consider or budget off of. We have a few different services listed here. These are going to be the most common services that we offer and that we see people, especially in the nonprofit space, utilizing. But we do have a wide variety of services that can be applied to make sure you can overcome basically any language barrier in any situation. So the first service here is on-demand phone interpreting. Essentially, it's a hotline that you can call and be connected to an interpreter in less than 60 seconds. Our connection time is actually usually less than 30 seconds, but I like to give us a little bit of a buffer. So it's pretty instantaneous. It's $2 a minute for Spanish and $2.50 a minute for all other languages. So it can be very affordable. This is really great for on-demand conversations. If a consumer walks into your organization and it talks to somebody at your front desks and needs help right then. Or if you have employees that are out in the field doing home visits and they come across a consumer or a family member that they need some immediate language assistance with, this is a great service to get someone on the phone immediately in over 200 languages to help you out, right? The next service is on-site interpreting. This is going to be more like if you have a meeting that's scheduled with a consumer where you know that they need language support, or if you have an event where you want to make sure that you're providing language support because you know that LEP consumers might be coming, the on-site interpreting would be a great option for you. So here we have $50 an hour for spoken languages, and then $60 an hour for American Sign Language. And one thing you want to note here is that 2-hour minimum. Virtual interpreting is going to be very similar to on-site interpreting. It's what you're seeing today with Rebecca interpreting for us. It's a live interpreter that joins a virtual meeting or a virtual event. Again, these are going to be better for things that are pre-scheduled, that you already know you're going to need language access for, or you want to go ahead and just provide language access in case you have consumers that will be joining you. And then here at the bottom, just a little bit about how translation is priced. There's a lot of nuance to the way that Una's team goes about pricing projects, including details like the number of words being translated, the source and target languages, any project management or design time. There's all sorts of things that are considered when going into pricing a project. And so that's something she'll talk about more in depth as she gets into her section. But just to kind of put it out there just a little bit, we do have a $70 project minimum, and that'll come into play here in just a second when I give you a kind of some specific examples.
Yeah, Tiffany, just a quick question.
Yeah.
On the on-demand phone interpreting, do you have a sense of what the typical length of a call like that? I mean, is that 5 or 10 minutes or?
It depends. I mean, it really does range. We do see a lot of our folks utilizing that for shorter conversations. But it's always going to depend on the conversations that you're having, right? Or if you have any of these other resources in place. One of the hospital networks that we work with utilizes phone interpreting instead of on-site interpreting. And so their calls are much longer than maybe a nonprofit that may use it for a quick 5-minute conversation with a consumer.
Sure. That makes sense.
It's going to vary widely. But to your
Right.
point, the nice thing about phone interpreting is there's no minimums for the on-demand service. So if you only need 3 minutes of support, then you're talking $6, right?
Right. Yeah, that seems very flexible. And when you say that you can get to, virtually any language you need, that's amazing.
Yeah. Great question.
Okay. Remember to give us your questions in the chat as Tiffany's going through here.
Yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to take that pricing that I just mentioned and give a specific example and how someone in this sector might budget. So here, an example is a food bank, which is one project I've been working on recently with one of our larger local food banks. So I'm giving a couple of examples of where they may see language barriers or language access opportunities, and then how they might budget for that for the year. So here, if we have a helpline, then what we're going to do is we're going to take the number of calls per year to the helpline. And we have, let's pretend the average call time, Brian's question, is 5 minutes. So maybe these are just short questions, usually about where a pantry is located or the operating hours or requirements for services, right? So if we're going to target that Spanish speaking population, then ideally, once we get to the point where our marketing efforts are that we have targeted the Spanish speaking population and they're coming to us with questions, then ideally, eventually 9% of those calls essentially would be Spanish speaking or LEP consumers. So if we take that, then we're taking 9% of those calls. Now, this is important to think about too. With interpreting, typically with spoken languages, for regular appointments or everyday conversations, you're going to be utilizing what we call consecutive interpreting. What that means is I would speak, and then the interpreter would speak, and then the consumer would speak, and then the interpreter would interpret that, right? So essentially, you have to think about the fact that you're doubling the time of that conversation to give the interpreter time to speak in between in the other language. So what we're going to do is so instead of the average call time of 5 minutes, we're going to budget for those specific calls to be 10 minutes. And then here we're taking that price and getting a number, right? Now, again, this is going to be a number that's going to be a little bit high because we are anticipating our marketing machine rocking and rolling and bringing in all these great Spanish calls, and it's going to take you a little bit of time to get there. But this may be, a high expectation of what you might be spending. So then we're going to be thinking about that next bucket of communication, the consumer consultations. So here, again, you can use data from your organization and say, we take X number of appointments per year. Here, our made up number is 500, to help consumers to fill out the benefits application form. And the average appointment time is 1 hour. Again, same line of thought, 9% of those appointments, the number of hours. Again, here, consider that the number is 2 because we have that 2-hour minimum. We get our total number of interpreting hours times the price. And here we've got a number to put into our budget. The last 2 examples that I'll give you are interpreters for live events. So again, with the food pantry, maybe they have a live service every single Saturday, and we want to make sure that we have a Spanish speaking interpreter at every single event for 2 hours. So again, how many Saturdays are we hosting? Multiply that by the number of interpreting hours, and you've got a nice number to budget with. And then the last example that I'll give you is translation for marketing materials. Again, super basic. Una's going to go into a lot more detail with how these things are priced and how she's worked through a much larger and more complicated project. But if you're just thinking about, well, we're going to translate 2 flyers into Spanish and a couple social media posts, in addition to copy, again, you have to think about those are going to be very small projects based upon the fact that they're going to be very few number of words. So let's go ahead and estimate that each project would fit our project minimum, which is $70. So 70 times 6, and that gives us a nice number here. So these are all the totals. This organization might budget, about $11,500 for their first year. Maybe they budget half of that for their first year as they start to ramp up those services and servicing the Spanish speaking population. And then maybe that's their full budget for their second year, but it can at least give you a place to start. The other thing I would suggest is when you start working with more LEP communities, you're gonna have a lot of, oh, I wish I would have thought of that, or, oh, we need interpretation for this, or I wish this was translated. So if you have data like this to advocate for a larger language services budget than you might need, then it gives you some wiggle room for some of those things that pop up that you weren't expecting. So just something to think about. And that is my portion of the session, all my math problems.
Yeah. Well, Tiffany, quick question as you wrap up then. You talked about coming to live events. what is there a travel fee associated with that? Or I mean, if in terms of your interpreters coming to, to that food bank every Saturday or whatever for a year, do they have to budget additionally for that, or is that included?
That's a great question. So we will always try to send local interpreters to jobs to be able to provide service. If you are requesting a language that's more rare, or perhaps you're in a very rural area where we don't have a lot of interpreters, then there may be travel fees assigned to it. Travel is always included for interpreters that we can, or for appointments that we can provide local interpreters for. But there may be fees if an interpreter needs to travel 40 miles to be able to interpret, to be able to join an appointment. Does that make sense?
So if they're, I don't know if it's this simple, if they're in a major city, they probably could count on having a local resource. If they're kind of out a little bit, then they maybe would plan for some additional travel time and expense.
Yeah, and they can ask that question when requesting services. Most of the time the travel is going to be included. It is pretty rare that we see travel charges added. But for instance, Luna is providing the interpreters for the state health department vaccination clinics. And we had to send, it's a lot of interpretation hours. So we had to use, and these are in Gary and Jeffersonville and Fort Wayne. And so with some of the appointments, because we didn't have enough local interpreters to cover it, there may be a couple where travel is needed for us to send people from Indianapolis. But we work with the client to let them know what that looks like ahead of time so that there's no surprises when they get their invoice.
Sure. Okay. Very good. Very good. Okay. We'll keep moving along here. I want to introduce Una Hartzell-Baird, who's the Director of Translation for Luna Language Services. She'll be talking with us through, or taking us through, a major project that they did with the American Red Cross, and explain how she helped them to build a budget for that. She will also share information about avoiding common pitfalls of translation pricing. We want to make you most efficient as you can be in the use of resources. And she'll talk about understanding how to choose a quality and affordable vendor. So Una, I want to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. In a previous life, I worked in operations. So efficiency and maximizing budgets is definitely where I am at. Go ahead and share my presentation here. Okay, so I love using case studies to illustrate data and information. I think storytelling is one of the best ways, and certainly the least boring way to share facts and information. So I'm excited to share our case study with the work that we did with the Indiana region of the American Red Cross. As the Red Cross has seen an increase in a need for language access and has met that need, they have reached out to Luna on both interpreting and translation work. And sometimes that means we're doing something very quickly because there is a fast deadline that's come up. And other times, like the example I'll share today, we worked in advance of a program beginning because it was part of a grant application that they were putting together. So when we assess a project, a scope of work for something, whether it's for a grant or whether it's just for a quick flyer, then what we're looking at is what is the source content? So, these Word documents, how long is it? Is it InDesign? What are the target languages that we need to consider? And then also, what are the technical requirements? And this becomes especially important if we're working with video, audio, or design software. With this grant application, we had 3 buckets of different types of projects. So we had a known bucket where the Red Cross already had the materials developed, and for about 90% of those, there wouldn't be any major changes, and we could start looking at them and have a pretty good idea exactly what would go into completing those projects. Then our next bucket was where they had an idea of a project that was going to happen and it had a scope of work, but it just wasn't a tangible product yet for us to look at and assess. But we had sort of a good enough framework that we could make some assumptions about that would lead us to a pretty solid budgetary estimate. And then our final group was an area we had to predict. And this was specifically for government messaging that the Red Cross was going to be amplifying. And certainly most of this is around the COVID-19 messaging. As we all experienced over the last year and still keep experiencing, there's a lot that can change even day to day. And so we used some of the past government messaging and looked at the format and the timing for that to predict a fairly accurate both cadence at which the work would come, as well as an approximate word count and volume that would become relevant to the pricing piece of this. And as we looked at all of these different areas, we assessed them based on the languages that the American Red Cross for the Indiana region asked us to look at. So we had about 9 languages that were relevant in this region, and that also included American Sign Language, especially because Indiana has a considerable deaf population. And while, you know, we may think that captions would work great and we don't need to do anything more, people who are American Sign Language users as their native language don't necessarily also have English as their native language. So for true language access, we needed to accommodate them by using video overlay of ASL interpreters interpreting the message that was being spoken on the screen. And then finally, as we looked through all of that, we also had to take a look and see if there were any images that needed to be changed or recreated, for example, charts or graphs that might need text to be updated on there. And this helped us form an overall picture of what was required for these different steps. Now, some of you may be brand new to this and maybe haven't done a ton when it comes to language access or accessing translation work. And some of you may already be doing this old hat. Some of you I know are folks that we work with every day at Luna. But no matter where you are, when you are looking at the needs for your organization, you really want to put together a plan that's broad in terms of the types of considerations you make, but then also very specific about what you need for any individual project. So first, looking broadly, you want to take a look at your community. Just like the information that Tiffany shared, who's in your community? What are the languages that they're speaking at home, and what's going to be important for you to have? Ideally, it'd be great if you had all the languages spoken in the world, but realistically, who's most likely to walk through your door, and how can you best be prepared? The second area to consider is the legal requirements. So we've talked about Title VI and federal requirements if you are receiving federal funds, and certainly hospitals, courts, education all fall under this. But there are even some nonprofit organizations that don't necessarily fall within that scope, but because they're receiving grants either from the state or from the federal government, may have this as a tie-in. You also want to look at, what are some of the things that could pose a legal liability to your organization if there is a miscommunication, and consider those documents, particularly like intake forms or vital documents that you have, like consent forms or agreements with clients. And then finally, you want to consider the most, to say the least. And here, what I'm talking about is what are the things that are most often used? What are the things that are most critical to communicate in your organization? And this would be things like, for example, during COVID, the almost daily changing of messaging on safety procedures and, whether you were doing temperature checks or not, whether you were going to be closed for that day or not, things like that that might be critical in terms of timing to communicate. You want to think about things that are also the most broad. So the information about your organization in those target languages versus things that are more specific, like those one-time event flyers or special things that, or special programs that may not be part of your regular offering. Now, I grew up in the 90s and absolutely love the Goosebumps books. So I use R.L. Stine as my mnemonic to remember all of the parts that, that we go through as a checklist to ensure that a project is both cost-effective and quick to turn around. So when we look at this, we're looking at, do you have documents that are raw and editable for us to work with, or will we need to recreate something? For example, if your intake forms have been printed and are filled out and handwritten, that will take recreation time versus having a digital format that's filled out on a computer that we can more easily access. Likewise, when you're looking at marketing materials or welcome materials, are your images localized to the community? If the people featured in the photos that you have are not reflective of the community that you're serving, then that's something that you'll want to take into account with when you do your translation work. Next, of course, you consider the source and the target languages. And this is where pricing can vary pretty widely depending on how many people speak a language, how many people work professionally in that language for translation, and how many, and where in the world they're located. So there are market forces at play here that help to determine some of the costs on that. And at Luna, we provide nonprofit discounts, particularly for Spanish. Our rate is a pretty standard 12 cents per word for that for nonprofits, and it really can go a long way for our community. You also want to consider the instructions. Are there special ways that you want to receive these documents? Anything that you have that may be confidential, you may not want to send or receive via email, and so we can work with you through that. Also, are you expecting to receive a bilingual table with your translation, or a camera-ready flyer that you can just send off to the printer and have ready to go? These are the types of instructions you want to take a look at. And then, of course, nonprofit and other discounts. Depending on who you're working with, they may not be well-versed on or which organizations are nonprofits and which ones are not. So be sure to ask about discounts as well as volume discounts, and know whether the language partner you're selecting is able to stack discounts or if they only offer one at a time and have you choose. At Luna, we will stack things together to make this as accessible as possible, since our mission at Luna is to provide language access to as many people as possible. And then finally, what are your expectations? And this goes beyond just your expectations for how your product will be returned, but what are your expectations for communication? Do you need to be able to reach someone by phone? Do you expect an email immediately, or 24 hours or 48 hours? And these are the sorts of things that you can be upfront about with language services partners, and things that you want to kind of keep in mind as you're assessing them as well. And that really brings us to a key point here as you're looking at language services and determining how, and who you're going to work with here. There are a variety of ways to look at different language service providers and determine where the right fit is. Ultimately, what it comes down to is, who do you trust to do the work and to help support you in your mission and to help support language access and accessibility to your clients. There are a number of things you can look at from certification. For example, at Luna, we hold both the ISO 9001 and 17100 standard certifications. These are international standards that are set by an international body. So we follow the same processes as any other agency around the world that has these certifications. Likewise, you can look at references, you can look at online reviews. There's a number of ways to source this. And a few questions that I've also included, and some that I would encourage you to consider here are, ask yourself, how responsive is this vendor? And is this something that's really critical to me? Do I have sometimes information that needs to be updated quickly, or last minute changes that I may need to make? And if it takes them 2 to 3 business days to reply to me, will this be a good way for us to work? Will this be a good fit? What are their processes? Are they providing translation, editing, and proofreading? Are they using native, professional translators or machine translation, which certainly has its place, but perhaps not if you're dealing with marketing materials or sensitive information. What services do they offer? Is it just that translation, editing, and proofreading, or will they also do formatting work? Can they manage videos? Will they be able to create transcripts and put together subtitles? And if this is something that is important to your organization, it's important to look at that so that you don't have to end up having 3 different vendors for all of this work. Are there projects that they won't work with? Certain organizations and certain topics are not necessarily considered mainstream in a lot of other cultures. And so it may be difficult to find translators who are willing to take on the work and do a good job of that translation if you're working in a sensitive area. How do they guarantee their quality? And what happens if something goes wrong? So we all know, everyone's human, and at Luna, we're using humans to do the translation work. What happens if the translation that you receive back has a mistake or the file is corrupt? How quickly will they get back to you, and how do they manage projects like that? What happens if you just decided one of the lines needs to change, and how will that be handled in the future? Likewise, how trusted are they? Are they able to provide references? Do you know anyone else in your community that works with them that can give you some information and feedback on their work and the values that they the value that they provide? And then likewise, do their values align with yours? Are they an organization that's supportive of the type of work that you're doing? Are they an organization that's responsive to nonprofits in the community? Where do their values align with yours? And if this is something that's critical to the success of your project, then that's a great place to start. And I'm going to stop my share now and send it back to Brian.
There we go. Sorry about that. I muted myself in case there was any background noise here. So Una, just a quick question. I mean, if somebody wants to work with you, what does engaging that process look like? I mean, do they, is there a proposal? Is there a contract? Is it a phone call? How would they start that connection?
That's a really great question. So we like to make it as easy as possible. We also work with a lot of individuals in the community, so we don't require any, lengthy paperwork or contracts, especially for smaller projects or things that might be one-offs. We do offer certainly agreements, contracts, volume pricing for clients that have ongoing needs, and that may, within their own organizational structure, require these types of agreements and contracts up front before they start. So we really meet our clients where they are.
Very good. Terrific. Okay. I think we're going to move back to Tiffany now. And she's going to talk briefly about building language resources into department budgets and including them in grant proposals. So Tiffany, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, I work with a lot of our clients or potential clients to help them through this process of budgeting, writing it into their budget, or even with our nonprofits, giving them the information they need for their grant proposals. The more nonprofits that I've worked with and the more that we talk about this, language access isn't just for the Immigrant Welcome Center. It isn't just for, the Latino specific serving organizations. Really, any organization that serves the greater community can really think about this and take some of the data that we talked about earlier and put that into their grant proposals. And it actually makes your proposal stronger to your funders because you're thinking about the diversity of your community and the intentionality behind serving the full population or attempting to, right? So it is something that we suggest that all grant proposals have a little bit of, that written into their grant proposal, and putting it ahead into your budgets. I've seen it in a communications budget line. I've seen it in administration. I've seen it in marketing. Even one of the organizations I work with, they have a budget line that is just under barrier removal. And they've utilized that to pay for some of the translation services that they've used. So there's opportunities for you to go ahead and place those into your planning, so that you already have those resources available. There are also sometimes grants that are very specific to supporting language access. I think, Una, you have a specific example that's active right now, right?
Yes, and we are going to share this via email after the presentation as well. But there is a community project grant from the Indiana Language Roadmap that's open now. It's up to $1,000 to support community projects throughout Indiana that align with the priorities of its strategic plan. The deadline for that is May 1st for submission, and we'll share the link and the information for that.
And I just popped the link for that in the chat as well. But yeah, I would say, again, reach out to myself or Una. One thing that Una and I do work together a lot with on clients is what we call a wish list. So our team is happy to put together an itemized proposal or quote for any of the documents or any of the projects that you're considering. So many times with my clients, I say, think about if you had an unlimited budget, or if you wanted to really just dive into language access in the next year, what are all of the things that you'd like to do? Let's put an itemized, and what are all the languages that you'd like to include? Let's put together an itemized quote for you. And then you can see exactly what that spend looks like and decide, yes, we can do all of this year, or hey, let's focus on Spanish and let's prioritize these items this year. Next year, we'll finish out Spanish. The year after that, we'll add Burmese, whatever that looks like. But it gives you the real data to be able to build out those budgets and to be able to plan to make sure that you're continuing on this journey. We always talk about how language access in an organization is a journey. It's not like tomorrow, every single thing in your organization needs to be available in Spanish. Folks like myself and Una can help you to figure out, where do I start and what steps can I take right now? And then, what follows that.
Very good. Well, let's see if we have any additional questions. What is a common item, project, or language component that organizations commonly forget about?
From the interpretation side, I preach a lot about the phone services because I feel like many times in the past, we have gotten calls from nonprofits who are like, I have someone standing in front of me and I need help and I didn't expect them to be here, but I don't have a budget to pay for your services. That's kind of why Una and I started doing a lot of these discussions to help people to plan ahead for that. But I think one thing that people commonly forget about is the unexpected. So how do you have a service line in place to help you to manage that? And so that your employees have the confidence that they can communicate with anyone if they come to you. And that's really what something like that on-demand phone service can assist you with.
I think another one in translation specifically is that it takes time to do a translation, and it takes more time than interpreting, even when consecutive. Because think about when you are typing something, how much slower I always say the words in my head as I'm doing it, and you slow yourself down as you're doing it. Now do it from one language to another, and make sure it's really good too. So typically professional translators are working on about 1,500 to 2,000 words a day. So that's an 8-hour work day that you could expect for that. So if you have, a 36-page, like let's say, for example, HR benefits packet that needs to be translated, it's not going to happen in 2 hours. So being able to plan in advance and think through some of these needs is super important, because then your expectations for quality can be matched with the reality of how quickly these projects can be completed, especially when it comes to having files that are not available in an editable format. If we have to spend time recreating a file, that does take quite a bit of time to put together, especially depending on you know, how simple or complicated the design of the file is and how dense it is in terms of the actual word count as well.
I want to, if I can, I want to add to one question that I commonly get in general is, what about Google Translate? It's free. Why can't you just use that? I know Una and I deal with this a lot. Google Translate is an exceptional tool, and it gets better every single day. We refer to tools like Google Translate as machine translation, right? But the way that I kind of describe it to people is, you know, with Google Translate or with machine translation, you're going to have mistakes that maybe grammar mistakes, or maybe the word isn't just right, or the spelling or the context isn't just right. And so the way that I kind of put it into words that are a little bit more accessible or understandable to people is, it's almost like a fourth grader that's like translating something for you. So if you have content that you'd be confident having a fourth grader, you know, reiterate and, you know, to their parents or something, and reiterate it correctly, by all means, like if it's something that isn't sensitive information or doesn't need to look professional, or, you know, if it's just really basic information and you're just trying to get through, you know, basic understanding or understanding the gist of a conversation, it is an exceptional tool. But just trying to think about the gravity of, like, would I have my fourth grader write something out for me? Would I expect the grammar to be there and the spelling to be correct and all these things? Like, if those are the things, that's how I kind of evaluate whether I should pay for services or whether I should utilize free services, if that's helpful.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, if you're investing to have something, you know, put together and printed and those kinds of things, would think you wouldn't want the casual translation. It wouldn't seem like, of the machine translation or the fourth grader translation. That's an interesting way to think about it. Very good. Okay. Well, doesn't look like we have any other questions at this point. I appreciated your kind of sharing your recommendations there. I took away that, I mean, the lep.gov, R.L. Stein. I'm still trying to figure out what the reference was to Greece. I just saw that a few weeks ago, so that picture popped right to mind that my daughter's been watching it. But you know, the other takeaways, I mean, that this is affordable for most nonprofit organizations. They really should be thinking about it. And as you said, get it set up ahead of time, even if they're not diving in too deeply right now or starting on the journey, because they're going to need it, and they want to serve the people, you know, in their community and be ready to do that. And that they would reach out to one of you to start the conversation, that you're going to meet them where they are, and they don't have to be all prepared or have an RFP together or anything like that before they can start talking to you about it. So is there anything else that we want to take away before we wrap up or land the plane here? Una, did you have something else, or Tiffany, one of you?
I would just reiterate reaching out to myself or Una. Like, we're always happy to answer questions and provide information to help you figure out what your pathway is. I placed our email addresses in the chat, you know, Tiffany@luna360.com and Una@luna360.com. And I'll place that information in the email afterwards, as well as in the description of the YouTube video.
Terrific.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. And on the translation side, I know that document translation can feel really overwhelming because it has so many more steps than just picking up the phone and getting an interpreter there to help you. But it's one of the things that my team is there to help you walk through it and make sure that we're going to ask all the questions so there are no surprises at the end for you, and we'll help you set it up to be the most cost-effective possible, and make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of expectation.
Yeah, and I can vouch for that. We've had Luna doing some translation of some articles from our newsletter, and they've made it very, very easy. And the turnaround has usually been faster than we expected, even. So that's been, they've been a pleasure to work with. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As Tiffany said, you'll get an email and you'll get a recording of the session here. I hope you'll share it with anybody in your organization that needs to learn more about this. And look forward to future Luna webinars. Tiffany keeps us all in the loop. So thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.